Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's lunch time, but before having lunch, I want to touch upon a hot issue: how Chinese Communist Party has succeeded in inducing those developing economies in the global South, in the Indo-Pacific region, to support China's some policies, because they are benefiting from Chinese aid and Chinese some support, regardless of human right, and sometimes humanitarian point. Some dictators are benefited from the Chinese Communist Party's support for their regimes. So, understanding and countering China's global South strategy in the Indo-Pacific, written by John Lee at Hudson Institute in September 3rd. I want to summarize his views on this issue, which is quite important, as United States is increasing its influence more and more in the Indo-Pacific areas with key allied partners like South Korea and Japan, Philippines, Vietnam, India, and so on. So if we look at executive summary of this paper, while the United States and advanced economies and democracies in Europe and Asia are hardening their views and position against China, the latter is gaining much ground with respect to the developing economies of the global South. It is true, indeed. China increasingly demands that developing nations base their discourse and policies on approaches that Beijing supports. And many global South nations are increasingly complying to the Chinese Communist Party's demand. That is to say, a growing number of these nations have started to alter and adopt discourse and policies that better align with Chinese demands and preferences, which means that U.S. hegemonic power in this region is losing its influence. So, in the Indo-Pacific area, where that will largely determine the future shape of the global strategic landscape, evidence shows that developing nations are observing Chinese norms and preferences, even though it's authoritarian, and gradually adjusting their thinking and behaviors accordingly, rather than American-led, universal democratic principles. So China's progress vis-a-vis the global South, especially in the Indo-Pacific area, depends on what material inducement and opportunities Beijing can offer. These are most successful when they prioritize rapid development and regime security over liberal economic rules and individual rights, which Group of Seven West advanced economies favored. Meanwhile, regardless of where the fault lies, many developing nations do not believe they have benefited as much materially or institutionally from the U.S.-led order of G7 economic order as they would like or expect. Instead, they choose China's orientations and philosophies. Also, members of the Global South often believe the Chinese narrative about the alleged failure of the U.S.-led globalization in the post-colonial and post-Cold War periods. For this reason, many developing economies believe that the interests and the values of these nations, or at least those of the regimes in power, better align with what China is promising than with what Washington is delivering. The United States and allies such as Japan and Australia have to accept and respond to this reality. Otherwise, they will be losing their national interest in the region, competing against Chinese influence. So John Lee analyzes in this paper, this report, that and assesses why and how China is making worrying progress when it comes to shaping and influencing the policies and actions of developing economies in the Indo-Pacific. And John Lee explains why this is a significant problem for the US and its allies. It then offers some recommendations to counter the Chinese Global South strategy in the region. So, in offering about 6 recommendations, this report argues that the US can complicate China's bid for leadership within the Global South. Also argues that the US can increase the cost and the risk for Beijing. And the US can challenge and change narratives and discourse favoring China in the Global South. And also the US can compete more effectively in the normative and in institutional context. So John Lee analyzes and assesses the problems and the solutions, how the United States, along with its allied powers like Japan and also Australia, New Zealand, in the Indo-Pacific area, that how to decrease the Chinese. I think this paper is very important. In our picture, China's economy is declining still because they have accumulated a lot of influence during the past 3 to 4 decades with much economic age and Chinese way of managing countries are more favorable than American way of democracies by those developing country leaders. This is very important for future democratic world order also, and the state can in East Asia, where Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan